Hi, I'm Rollan Marquez, and here's my presentation on the analysis of ITTS's teaching and learning during COVID 19 through the lens of four distance education subsystems. The Institute of Technical Training Services is a private vocational training provider in Muscat, Oman, uh, that works closely with the Ministry of Manpower, Ministry of Education, and international awarding bodies to provide skills training certification to Omanis. Before the COVID 19 pandemic, the teaching and learning model used was face to face and hands on. The instructors were basically the source of knowledge and the ones who did the practical demo for the learners or trainees. When the pandemic struck in 2020, ITTS was forced to change its approach in teaching. Teaching became online through Zoom and Google Classroom. Practical training was unfortunately affected. It was suspended during lockdowns and resumed later under strict health protocols as mandated by the government. Assessments were also done online, like quizzes and exams, through Google Classroom. Implementation of distance education subsystems during the COVID 19 pandemic. The sudden change from a face-to-face approach to online learning meant IDTS should make a lot of adjustments or modifications in their teaching approach or instructional design to follow design models like ADDIE. Instead of creating self-instructional materials, which would take more time, effort, and resources, the Institute instructors reused existing face-to-face lecture notes and slides for live Zoom sessions. The development of guided didactic conversation within the materials was largely absent. This also failed to follow the ideal distance education model where a team of subject matter experts, instructional designer, media specialists systematically creates structured, self-paced materials. Teaching at ITTS during the pandemic became remote, although it still remained synchronous through Zoom classes. The teacher's role, however, expanded to include technical troubleshooting and online demonstrations. While Holmberg's principle of learning through mediated communication was applied, the practical knowledge of the social and political context required for vocational training became a bit of a challenge online. The 100% face to face, instructor centered model was replaced by a technology dependent model. This created some issues in most of the teachers and students because they were not accustomed to Zoom and Google Classroom. The student support subsystem has three core components: academic, administrative, and technical. During the pandemic, ITTS focused almost exclusively on technical support. However, other supports were non-existent. There was no online library or counseling services to address the personal, family, or work-life balance problems that affected distance learners. There was also no formal orientation to prepare students for the nature and demands of online learning. The pandemic forced ITTS on a crisis management approach. ITTS was reactive in its attempt to maintain continuity rather than being strategic. There was no time for the Institute to conduct analysis of the socio-economic, educational, cultural milieu. The sudden dependence of students and even instructors for technical support illustrated a failure to coordinate the roles of teaching staff, technical support, and administration. Now let's look at the most important part of our analysis: the gaps between what ITTS did during the pandemic and what a properly designed distance education system should look like. During the pandemic, ITTS used an an ad hoc approach. They simply converted the existing face-to-face lecture notes into slides for Zooms. There's no systematic model like ADDIE. In a proper DE context, we use a structured instructional design process to create self-instructional materials that are clear, interactive, and designed for independent learning. The gap here is between reactive crisis teaching and proactive planned distance education. What IDTS did is what researchers call emergency remote teaching, not true distance education. This leads to poor content, structure, and low learner engagement. Second, learner autonomy and control. ITTS students were forced into a technology dependent model with almost no choice over their pace or schedule. There was no training to help them become self directed learners. Proper DE leverages learner autonomy. It provides structure but also flexibility, and it actively teaches students how to manage their own learning. The gap, absence of pedagogical scaffolding. The pandemic model assumed students already had digital literacy and self regulation skills. But a good DE system recognizes that these skills must be taught and supported, especially for vocational learners used to hands on instructor guidance. Third, student support. IETS focused almost entirely on technical support, helping students use Zoom and Google Classroom. There was no evidence of a dedicated online library, counseling services, or proactive advising. A proper DE system has integrated academic, administrative, and emotional support, including orientation, library access, and proactive outreach to struggling students. The gap is a fragmented support system. ITTS reacted only to immediate technical problems. Good DE support is holistic and proactive, anticipating student needs before they become barriers to success. Fourth, practical and vocational training. This is the biggest gap. ITTS suspended hands on workshops and replaced them with simple online activities or teaching. For a vocational institution, this is a critical weakness. Proper DE for vocational training requires creative solutions, home-based lab kits, augmented reality, virtual reality, or blended models with intensive on-site sessions. So the gap is the unresolved skill gaps. The pandemic exposed that translating practical skill development to a pure DE model is very difficult without major investment in specialized pedagogy and technology. ITTS's return to 100% face-to-face confirms this challenge remains unsolved. Finally, organizational alignment. During the pandemic, ITTS operated under a temporary crisis-driven structure. There were no clear policies for faculty workload, compensation, or intellectual property for online courses. A sustainable DE system requires clear policies, ongoing faculty development, a dedicated support unit, and integration of DE into the institution's strategic mission. The gap is crisis management versus strategic management. The pandemic exposed the lack of a long-term DE plan. Without policy changes, any future disruption will face the same chaotic response. The COVID-19 pandemic acted as a catalyst, forcing ITTS to abruptly transition to remote teaching. While this ensured institutional survival, it fell far short of a properly implemented distance education system. The analysis revealed significant gaps between ITTS's emergency response and the best practices described in Modules 6 to 9. Their primary gaps lie in the absence of systematic instructional design, a fragmented and reactive approach to student support, and the critical challenge of delivering practical, hands on vocational training online. ITTS successfully managed the crisis, but it failed to build a sustainable DE system. The institution's post pandemic decision to return to 100% face to face instruction confirms this. Learning from this period should not to abandon DE, but rather to build it, to help the institute manage any similar uh, future crisis. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.